Hey there, it's Silver. This is Bloodhound. So Bloodhound is a neo-retro shooter that I would say personally probably has the closest analog would be Painkiller, I think. There's a little bit of SilverSeraphym DNA in here as well, but I think Painkiller is the most obvious sort of inspiration. You've got a pretty long set of levels split into 5 different acts or chapters, and the levels are quite linear, but they are also full of relatively large arenas and stuff, so that's what I mean by a lot of Painkiller in here. It feels very similar to that structurally, although the game also does do the SilverSeraphym thing of you pick up like half a health point and it spawns like the entire population of Miami to come kill you. So that does happen pretty frequently, but this is the sort of game where most of your enemies are spawned in, so it's not like a Doom kind of setup where the enemies are mostly on the map and only some teleport in. This is, again, the Painkiller / SilverSeraphym setup where most of the enemies you encounter, in fact pretty much all of them in this game, are going to be teleported in. The game sort of prides itself on having a pretty large arsenal and quite a few enemies on screen at any given time as well, it seems like, because some of the hordes you fight later on do get pretty large. Some of the larger courtyard areas and stuff have a lot of enemies spawning in at one time, and not quite like SilverSeraphym levels, but still quite a few. And the arsenal is pretty impressively sized. I believe it's about 10 weapons or so, which is quite a lot for a game of this sort, and you've also got several different power-ups that you can hold one of each that are important, because they are very powerful in terms of what they do, but you don't find them that often, so you want to save them for a really important time, usually some sort of boss fight or a really big arena, although depending on what difficulty you're on, some of your power-ups can be disabled in boss fights. So the way it works is pretty direct, pretty simple. You just spawn into a level and you walk forward, and eventually you find some sort of large circular or square arena where a whole bunch of enemies will spawn in, and that arena will have weapons and ammo and armor and health and stuff lying all around the place that you're expected to, go and find. And once you actually survive, you will go on to another sort of linear corridor-ish section. Usually it'll have some sort of branching path here and there that will lead off to some secrets, some ammo or some extra health or armor around the place somewhere, and then eventually you'll get to another arena, and then this will keep going until you go through some teleporters, go through some more levels, and then eventually reach a boss. And the boss fights are pretty challenging in this game, I would say, partially because you can't use your power-ups on higher difficulties, but also because they just have a lot of health, and they spawn in a lot of adds as they lose health. It depends on the boss you're fighting, but most of the time they have a couple of different weapons or attacks they can use against you, and quite a large wave of different sorts of enemies that will spawn in on a regular basis. So the boss fights are pretty hectic, although luckily the arenas for them tend to be a pretty good size. The levels themselves will also usually have a bunch of keys for you to find, and the progression is mostly gated behind your classic key hunt, so you need to go around the levels finding the keys, and then oftentimes backtrack to areas you've been recently, and then find the barriers that go with those keys. So yeah, it's a pretty simple setup. It's something that you've probably played a lot of times before in terms of its overall structure, but there's a reason that structure is used very often, because it tends to work quite well. As far as the arsenal goes, you've got quite a few pretty fun weapons to use. You start off with a revolver that is quite accurate, and all weapons do have an alt-fire, and the revolver's alt-fire whips out a second revolver, so you get double the fire rate, which is actually pretty fun to use because even though it's your starting weapon, it does do a pretty respectable amount of damage. You've also got a basic pump shotgun that is not that strong, actually, for a shotgun, but it does the job for a little while. And you'll also find your assault rifle pretty quick, and the assault rifle is pretty fun to use because it's got a very fast fire rate, and notably, its alt-fire is also a dual-wield kind of setup. It chews through ammo really fast, but double assault rifles is pretty fun and does a lot of damage. But later on, you'll start getting your more advanced stuff like a minigun, a set of double-barreled shotguns that have a harpoon underneath them so that you can use them to pull an enemy towards you, or if it's a particularly heavy enemy, it pulls you towards them. Either way, it's good because it allows you to get right up in the face with something, which is something you want to do with a double-barreled shotgun, especially 2 of them. And you'll also find some more advanced stuff later, like of course a rocket launcher. The rocket launcher in this game is really fun to use. It's probably my favorite weapon in the arsenal. It's got a really nice rhythm to its fire rate, and the rockets fly at just the right speed to be really fun to lead enemies with and stuff like that. It's just a really satisfying weapon to use, and does have a pretty significant splash damage range, so you gotta be careful about that, but it is fun, and its alt-fire lobs several rockets as grenades. So a bit of Unreal influence here. You'll just launch a couple of unlit rockets that will bounce around as grenades and then blow up, and they have the same very large splash radius, but it shoots 3 of them. So useful against either really strong enemies like bosses, or just sort of lob them randomly into a big crowd and watch the carnage. There's also an energy weapon, which is probably my second favorite weapon, which is a little bit like a shock rifle setup, but it doesn't have the shock combo, unfortunately, at least not that I could find. Its primary fire shoots out these sort of orbs of electricity. It's a relatively slow fire rate, but the balls themselves move pretty fast, and they have a little bit of splash damage. And this, I think, is what makes it so fun to use, because you gotta lead your enemies with it a little bit, because it's not a hit scan weapon. They do have some travel time, even though they're fast. And it actually reminds me a little bit of like the Tesla gun from Blood, but slower in terms of how it feels to use. And the alt fire is basically a railgun shot. It has a relatively long wind up, but after it winds up and uses a bunch of energy, it will fire this big piercing beam forward that does a ton of damage and can go through like all the enemies in a line. This weapon is also unique among the arsenal because it has technically infinite ammo. You don't find ammo pickups for it like you do for all the other weapons. Instead, it just regenerates its ammo over time. So you can just switch away from it and use something else for a while and then switch back and it'll have its batteries recharged, which is an interesting way to do it. There's also an honorable mention in the form of a crossbow that fires exploding crossbow bolts. They can nail enemies to walls, which is always satisfying, and just right-click and it will detonate all of the ones that you fired. So you can pepper an area with them and then have a big chain of explosions go off, and it's a very fun weapon to use. In terms of the power-ups you can find a big golden bullet that will give you infinite ammo for a short time. This is obviously useful for a lot of different situations, and you don't find this one very often because it is quite powerful. There's also an hourglass, which slows time. It almost stops it, really, and it doesn't last that long, but it is useful when you suddenly get surrounded or something, and it allows you to sort of break out of a very bad situation. And you've also got a sort of adrenaline shot that ups your HP all the way up to 300. It overcharges you more than normal health kits can overcharge you, and it stays there for a while, and once it goes down, it'll only go back down to its normal max of 100, so you can use it as like an emergency heal, basically. Also important in any neo-retro shooter is the things that you're shooting, and in this case there are 16 different unique enemy types, which isn't bad for a game like this. I would like to see a little bit more because of how many you're fighting and how long the levels can get, but still I think 16 is an okay number. It's not horrible, and they are pretty varied in terms of what they do. You know, some of them just charge you into melee, some of them have various projectile weapons, and unfortunately some of them are hit scanners, but more on that in a few. I would say its enemy variety is probably its weakest aspect because there just aren't that many of them, and there aren't that many unique behaviors among them. Like, a lot of them are kind of similar to each other. They're just like dude with gun of some kind. So there aren't a whole lot of like super unique things that make you immediately double take when you see one. Like, there isn't an archvile or anything that has that kind of impact, you know what I mean? The enemies are kind of uninspired, I would say. They're fine, but they just don't have anything that's particularly exciting or interesting, I think. And also some of them have boobs. There is a nudity feature in this game that you can turn on or off. Obviously, for recording a video, it's off, but I don't know. Look, if you're into that, that's fine. I do not judge what you're into. You can be into whatever you want. I don't care. But I gotta admit, I do find it really weird when developers feel the need to slap boobs on the things specifically that you have to kill only, and then make them like moan suggestively while you're shooting them to death. It's just a little bit weird to me. It's a little much. So that's how the game works in a traditional sense, but it's also got some downfalls. It's got some polish problems. There's a lot of bugs and other kind of unfortunate stuff that happens throughout this game. For one, the enemy spawning is really weird sometimes. The enemies spawn in with a very obnoxious particle effect that can obscure your entire screen, and there are often times where it spawns enemies directly where you're standing, so you walk into a room and suddenly you can't see anything because the entire screen is obscured by this big like cloud effect that happens when enemies teleport in, and then you're just immediately surrounded by stuff. The game also really loves to use its hit scanners in some very obnoxious ways. The hit scanners are very powerful in this game and can just snipe you from halfway across the world, and the game really loves to spawn one on either side of you as soon as you enter a doorway, so that as soon as you enter a new room, you take 2 hits of unavoidable instant damage that you could never have done anything about. It loves to do that. It does it like multiple times in every level, it seems like. Even if you're prepared for it, you still take immediate hit scan damage as soon as they spawn in, because enemies that spawn in can hit you before the spawn animation is actually finished. So this really doesn't help my enemy variety complaints, because some of the enemy variety is dedicated to just jerking you around and making you mad, basically. It also has a bit of a problem with wasted slots. It has a pretty impressive 10 weapon arsenal, but it's not as impressive when you realize that about 3 of those slots are kind of wasted. Because what a lot of games do is they have a weapon that uses the same ammo type as one of your previous weapons, but it's sort of a side grade so that there's a reason to go back to the previous weapon because they're not necessarily, it's not a straight upgrade. Like the super shotgun in Doom, for instance, is not a straight upgrade on the basic shotgun. There's a reason to go back to the basic shotgun even when you have the SSG, which is why it has its own slot. You have both of them at the same time. This game doesn't do that. Once you get the double-barreled shotguns, there is no reason to use the basic shotgun ever again. It's extremely weak in comparison, and you have plenty of shotgun shells, so the extra ammo doesn't matter. So basically, once you have those double barrels, there's no reason to ever use the normal one again, and it becomes a wasted slot. The same thing happens with the assault rifle and the minigun, which use the same ammo type. The minigun uses ammo at roughly the same rate as the assault rifle's alt fire, but it does way more damage. So again, going back seems pointless. Like every time you go back and start shooting with the assault rifles, you're just thinking, man, I could be using any other weapon and instead be saving this ammo for the minigun where it's actually more useful. So it does have a problem with wasting some of its slots, I feel. And then there's slot 8. Slot 8 is the chainsaw. The chainsaw is really bad and is basically a borderline useless weapon. It hits enemies when it feels like it, but most of the time your swipes will just go straight through enemies and not contact them. It also does very little damage, but enemies in melee do huge damage to you, which means it's absolutely not worth getting up close enough to use the chainsaw because they can hit you very easily and you will miss them most of the time because it just decided it didn't want to hit them. The alt fire of the chainsaw is a flamethrower that has the same problem. You can like bathe an enemy in this orange glow, and sometimes they take damage and sometimes they don't, and you can't really tell when. It doesn't help things that the flamethrower's firing effect is so incredibly bright that you can't see what you're doing while you're firing it. It's like very obnoxiously bright. So that weapon slot is basically entirely wasted on something that you'll never use because it just doesn't work. So the game is definitely lacking in the sort of polish department in a lot of ways. It's got a lot going for it, I think, with some pretty fun levels, and the weapons that are good are actually quite good and very fun to use. Like the arsenal might have some wasted space, but the space that isn't wasted is actually really good stuff, weapons that are fun to use. So it's not like none of the weapons are good, it's just that a couple of them are kind of dubious. So I think this game has a lot of flaws, and if you're going to get into it, then you have to be aware of those flaws right from the start. It definitely is a bit buggy. Like, for instance, I've had enemies like fall through the floor. I've had enemies go through walls, and I've also had the rocket launcher seems to frequently spawn the rockets in midair, but not actually launch them forward. So you'll just like fire the rocket launcher and the firing sound will happen, but no rocket will come out, and then you walk backwards and you see there's a rocket hanging in midair where you just were, and it'll eventually explode, by the way, which can kill you, so you gotta be careful about that. So yeah, it definitely has some bugs to work out as well, so the overall polish level of the game is questionable. I still think there's some fun to be had here. It's a nice little scrappy small project that is enjoyable in a lot of its levels. You know, there are exceptions like I've talked about, but I think that I was having fun with this game more than I wasn't, if that makes sense. Like, it's got a lot of problems, but I still was able to extract a fair amount of like classic shooter joy from it. So I guess this is something that I can recommend with a lot of caveats. If you're okay with the monsters being weirdly sexualized sometimes, if you're okay with the overall spawn behavior being kind of unpredictable and obnoxious sometimes in a way that seems some levels are designed just to upset you. Basically, some levels are meant to just kind of make you mad with very annoying spawns. And if you're okay with some of the weapons just not being all that useful or good while the others are, then yeah, this is actually a game that maybe you should pick up on sale or something like that. It's got flashes of brilliance in a sort of painkiller inspired formula, but it's got a lot of stuff holding it back, a lot of baggage that makes me not want to say I fully recommend it in its current state, but it's also not something that you should write off as being just completely terrible, because it's not. So if you are interested and you want to keep up with the game, maybe look at the various patches that have happened and stuff like that, you want to keep abreast of all that stuff, abreast because okay, then I'll link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can keep an eye on all that kind of stuff if you are interested. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.